karate from Chuck Norris and Tang Soo Do, and kung fu from Yip Man, from Wing Chun. He put it all together with Western boxing and wrestling. He realized like there's so many different ways to fight.
Showed his 1-inch punch.
People will always say, my gosh, Bruce Lee is the fastest person on earth.
He wasn't just fast. He was faster than belief itself.
When you do punch, now I'm leaning forward a little bit, hoping not to hurt any camera angle. I mean, you gotta put the whole hip into it and snap it.
Every movement looked unreal. Every strike felt like it came from another dimension. People said he could play ping pong with nunchaku, break wood with his fingers, and move faster than any camera could record. It sounds impossible until you see the footage and realize the legend was real all along. The 1-inch punch. A volunteer named Bob Baker stood confidently in Long Beach, arms crossed over his chest, ready to expose what he thought was another martial arts scam. The year was 1964, and the crowd at the International Karate Championships had seen plenty of flashy demonstrations. Bruce Lee placed his knuckles against Baker's chest, barely making contact. 1 inch of space, that's all. The explosion that followed changed martial arts forever. Baker's body launched backward like he'd been hit by a freight train, flying through the air before crashing into a chair that probably saved him from hitting the wall. The crowd went dead silent.
He was just so ahead of the times.
He'd go to Ed Parker's events in Long Beach, and they treated him like he was a god.
They just witnessed something that shouldn't exist according to everything they knew about physics and fighting. Stanford biomechanics researcher Jessica Rose would later spend months analyzing the footage frame by frame, running calculations that seemed impossible. Her findings shocked the scientific community. Bruce had generated over 1,500 newtons of force from that single inch of movement. That's enough power to crack ribs like twigs, yet he'd controlled it perfectly to send Baker flying without causing serious injury. The secret wasn't in Bruce's arm. His entire body had become a single weapon, a kinetic chain that started in his feet, twisted through his legs, accelerated through his hips, whipped through his core, and exploded out of his fist in one perfectly synchronized motion. Every muscle fiber fired in sequence, each one adding its power to the wave traveling up his body. The final snap of his wrist at impact multiplied the force like the tip of a whip breaking the sound barrier. Hundreds of martial artists have tried to replicate this feat since 1964. They study the footage, break down the mechanics, and train for years. Some get close enough to push someone back a few feet. None has matched the original. Because what Bruce demonstrated wasn't just technique or strength. It was the result of rewiring his entire nervous system to fire every muscle in perfect sequence. Something that took him 15 years of obsessive training to achieve. 2-finger push-ups. 2 fingers held Bruce Lee's entire body weight as he lowered himself to the floor and pushed back up, not once for a photo opportunity, 200 times in a row while carrying on a conversation about Taoist philosophy with James Coburn. Each finger supported roughly 40 pounds of dynamic shifting weight with every rep. This wasn't showing off. This was Tuesday morning, Bruce's warm-up routine before real training began. While other martial artists were still stretching, Bruce was turning his fingers into weapons that could strike with surgical precision or shatter boards like hammers.
It is.
No rules.
With no rules.
Not real fighting.
Well then, baby, you better train every part of your body.
The Guinness Book of World Records documented these feats, but even their officials struggled to believe what they were seeing. The journey to those iron fingers started with buckets of sand in his backyard. Every morning, Bruce would drive his fingertips into the sand 500 times. When that became easy, he switched to gravel. The skin tore, bled, and eventually transformed into something closer to leather than flesh. After 6 months of gravel, he moved to steel pellets. Most people would have permanent nerve damage. Bruce developed what doctors called impossible sensitivity alongside incredible strength. Bob Wall, who trained with Bruce for years, watched him perform these push-ups countless times and never saw him struggle. His breathing stayed normal, his form perfect, his conversation uninterrupted. Medical experts who examined Bruce found bone density that was off the charts. tendons that had thickened like steel cables, and muscle attachments that had actually restructured themselves to handle forces that would tear normal tissue apart. Invisibility to cameras.
You hear these stories constantly about people remembering the first time they saw a Bruce Lee movie.
William Bodine had directed over 300 films by 1966. He'd worked with everyone from Mary Pickford to Bela Lugosi. Nothing in his 40-year career prepared him for what happened on the Green Hornet set when Bruce Lee threw his first punch. The footage came back from the lab with what looked like a technical malfunction. Bruce appeared to stand perfectly still. Then suddenly the stuntman flew backward into a wall. No movement in between. Just stillness, then impact. The crew checked every camera, tested the film stock, and even brought in specialists from Kodak. Everything worked perfectly. The problem was Bruce. His punches were completing their entire arc faster than the cameras could record.
I'm leaning forward a little bit, hoping not to hurt any camera angle. I mean, you gotta put the whole hip into it.
Film ran at 24 frames per second back then. Bruce's fist traveled from his waist to full extension and back in less than 1/24 of a second. He was literally moving between the frames, invisible to technology designed to capture human movement. Bob Wall, who worked as both a stuntman and martial arts coordinator on the show, brought in specialized equipment to measure Bruce's speed. The numbers didn't make sense. One punch clocked at 0.05 of a second from start to impact. That's faster than the human eye can track movement. Faster than most people's reaction time to any stimulus. If Bruce decided to hit you, your brain wouldn't even register the punch until after it landed. The producers faced a bizarre problem. They had hired the most skilled martial artist in America, but audiences couldn't see what made him special. They had to ask Bruce to slow down, to make his movements visible for television. Bruce hated it. Every artificially slow punch went against 15 years of training to be faster, more efficient, more invisible. Later, when Bruce made his own films, he solved the problem by shooting fight scenes at 32 frames per second, then playing them back at 24. This made the action visible while preserving the speed that made it extraordinary. That's why Enter the Dragon's fights look different from every martial arts movie before it. The camera could finally see what Bruce had been doing all along. Shattering wood with fingers. In 1969, Bruce Lee stood before a massive crowd, ready to demonstrate something impossible. Two men held a wooden board between them, bracing for impact. Lee didn't wind up for a punch. He simply placed his fingers against the surface, barely drew them back, and drove them straight through the wood. The sound wasn't what anyone expected. Not a crack or a snap, but something closer to paper tearing. The board split perfectly down the middle. The board was solid oak, an inch thick, with no preparations or tricks. Years of two-finger push-ups and relentless conditioning had transformed his fingers into something beyond human. The calluses were thick as leather, the bones dense as iron. But that wasn't what made them dangerous. It was the control. Mastering the nunchaku. Dan Inosanto walked into Bruce Lee's backyard carrying two sticks connected by a chain. Bruce laughed. "That's a toy," he said, dismissing the nunchaku like he dismissed most traditional weapons. 3 months later, he was playing ping pong with them, never missing a return. The transformation started with humiliation. Bruce grabbed the nunchaku, gave them a confident swing, and cracked himself in the skull. Blood trickled down his face. Most people would have quit. Bruce saw a challenge that needed conquering.
It's a combination of both. I mean, here it is the natural instinct, and here is control.
For 12 weeks, he disappeared into what students called the nunchaku cave. 8 hours daily, swinging those sticks until they became extensions of his arms. He started with basic figure-8 patterns that children learn in classes. Within a week, he'd surpassed anything traditional Filipino masters taught. He wasn't learning forms. He was inventing them. The bruises covered his body for a month. Shoulders, ribs, elbows, skull. Each impact taught him momentum, angles, and physics. His wife, Linda, found him in the garage at 3 a.m., shirtless and dripping sweat. Nunchaku spinning so fast they hummed like helicopter blades. He calculated arc speeds and impact forces with scientific precision. Every motion served a purpose. By month 2, Bruce performed blindfolded routines that looked choreographed but were improvised. The nunchaku wrapped around his neck, under his arms, behind his back, never slowing. James Coburn said the sticks moved so fast they looked like solid circles floating around Bruce's body. Witnesses watched him play entire ping-pong games using nunchaku as paddles, putting spin on the ball by adjusting impact angles. When Fist of Fury premiered in 1971, audiences saw nunchaku combat that had never existed. Bruce created a new language of movement. The famous Game of Death scene wasn't traditionally choreographed. Bruce told Dan to attack for real and they'd improvise. Every strike became a redirect. Every block became a counter. He had turned a toy into an extension of his philosophy. The sandbag kick. Bruce Lee's training equipment terrified other martial artists. Walk into any Los Angeles gym in the late 1960s, and you'd find standard 70-pound heavy bags swaying gently from their mounts. Walk into Bruce's garage and you'd find something else entirely. His warm-up bag weighed 100 pounds, hanging from an industrial-grade steel chain thick enough to tow cars. Most fighters used that weight as their maximum resistance. Bruce used it to loosen up, but that was just a warm-up. His real training bag weighed 300 pounds, packed dense with steel shot and sand. Most men couldn't budget an inch with their hardest kick. Then one afternoon during a routine session, Bruce threw a side kick. The bag didn't swing. It exploded off the chain and launched 17 feet into the air, slamming against the garage ceiling hard enough to crack the wood. The physics seemed impossible. 300 pounds don't fly. Except when Bruce kicked them. That power translated directly to human targets. Witnesses watched him launch a 200-pound man backward with a single kick, even through protective padding. The volunteer landed 6 feet away, wind knocked out, ribs aching for days. Bruce hadn't been trying to hurt him. That was just what happened when you stood in front of legs that could shatter steel chains and send 300 pounds airborne like a missile. The training chamber. The lock on Bruce Lee's training room door wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep them safe from what was inside. When Linda Lee finally opened that room after Bruce's death in 1973, even hardened athletes who came to see it walked out shaking their heads in disbelief. 75-pound dumbbells sat where most fighters would keep 5-pounders. Bruce used these for shadow boxing, throwing hundreds of punches while holding what amounted to small anvils in each hand. Professional boxers who tried to lift them couldn't throw more than a few punches before their arms gave out. Bruce would go for 30-minute rounds, his movements as fluid as if his hands were empty. The weight wasn't the point. It was about programming his nervous system to treat normal punches like they were weightless. Ankle weights, 30 pounds each, turned his legs into pistons that could generate over 2,000 pounds of force. The chains hanging from the ceiling weren't for decoration. Bruce would attach them to his wrists and ankles during forms practice, fighting against resistance from every angle. Each movement had to overcome metal, trying to pull him back to center. The dragon flag setup was deceptively simple. A flat bench with padding worn down to almost nothing where Bruce's shoulders would rest. This exercise, which Bruce invented, required holding your entire body horizontal, using only your shoulders as a pivot point. Professional gymnasts can barely hold it for 10 seconds. Bruce would maintain the position for minutes while explaining techniques to students, his body rigid as a board, defying every law of leverage. Modern strength coaches study videos of Bruce's dragon flag and still argue about whether it's physically possible without hidden support. The physics say a 135-pound man shouldn't be able to create that much torque through his core alone. But multiple witnesses, including James Coburn and Steve McQueen, watched him do it repeatedly. The exercise is now considered one of the most challenging core movements in existence, and most athletic trainers won't even recommend it due to injury risk. Wong Jackman duel. Wong Jackman wasn't some street fighter looking for fame. He was Northern Shaolin royalty, trained from childhood in the temples of Hong Kong, carrying techniques passed down through 20 generations. When he arrived in San Francisco's Chinatown in 1964, the traditional masters treated him like visiting nobility. He could have opened his own school anywhere, commanded top dollar, and lived comfortably teaching ancient forms to wealthy students. Instead, he came for Bruce Lee, The challenge wasn't really from Wong himself. The Chinatown elders had been watching Bruce with growing anger. This young upstart was teaching white students, mixing Chinese techniques with Western boxing, publicly calling traditional sifus outdated and slow. Someone needed to put him in his place or close his school permanently. Wong Jackman was their enforcer, though he'd later claim he only wanted a friendly match. They met in Bruce's Oakland Kwun on a winter evening, with only 7 witnesses, including Linda Lee. No photographers, no reporters, just 2 fighters and a handful of people sworn to silence. The rules were simple, because there weren't any. Fight until someone surrenders or can't continue. Bruce wore his usual black kung fu slippers and loose pants. Wong dressed in the traditional robes of a Shaolin master. Wong struck first with classic northern-style techniques, long-reaching punches designed to keep opponents at a distance, beautiful forms, perfect structure, exactly what 20 years of traditional training produced. Bruce responded with something nobody had seen before. He closed the distance like a boxer, threw combinations like a street fighter, and kicked like a Thai warrior. Traditional met modern, and modern was winning. 3 minutes in, Wong was backing up, trying to create space for his long-range techniques. Bruce kept pressing forward, landing short hooks and straight blasts that Northern Shaolin had no answer for. When Wong turned to run, actually run around the room to escape, Bruce chased him down and swept his legs. The fight ended with Wong on the ground, Bruce's fist raised above his face, waiting for surrender. The aftermath mattered more than the fight itself. Wong claimed it was a draw, said Bruce never really hurt him, and insisted the witnesses were biased. Bruce didn't care about winning. He cared that he'd gotten winded chasing Wong, that his traditional Wing Chun techniques had felt slow and inefficient, that he'd won ugly instead of dominating. That night, he told Linda everything he'd been taught was incomplete. Speed and tradition weren't enough. He needed something new, something that took the best from every style and discarded the useless rituals. Revolutionizing the fight game, Jeet Kune Do. Bruce Lee stood in his Oakland Kwun in 1967, holding 20 years of certificates, belts, and traditional honors. Then he threw them all in the garbage. Every Wing Chun form he'd memorized since childhood, every classical technique passed down through generations, every rule about how real fighters were supposed to move, all worthless. The martial arts community thought he'd lost his mind. Here was someone who'd trained under IP Man himself, who could perform classical forms with perfect precision, suddenly declaring that all of it was garbage that would get you killed in a real fight. The traditional masters called him arrogant. Bruce called them obsolete, stuck performing dance routines while he was building something that actually worked. Using no way as way sounded like fortune cookie philosophy until you saw it in action. Traditional martial arts said you had to stand a certain way, block specific attacks with specific defenses, and follow patterns established centuries ago. Bruce said forget the patterns. If a boxing jab worked better than a Wing Chun straight punch, steal the jab. If a wrestler's sprawl defended takedowns better than kung fu stances, learn to sprawl. If a fencer's footwork created better angles than traditional stepping, then become a fencer.
Production of the film took place mostly in Thailand. Lee was surprised at how crude the filming was in comparison to Hollywood. And
what Bruce was attempting had never been done before. Each martial art had its own philosophy, body mechanics, and timing that contradicted the others. Most fighters spent lifetimes mastering one system because mixing them created chaos. Joe Rogan later explained what made Bruce different. He had a deep understanding of all these different martial arts and the courage to combine them, which was completely unheard of at the time. Bruce studied everywhere, China, the United States, with boxers, wrestlers, fencers, and then made it all work together. The foundation was ruthlessly simple. 3 principles that destroyed 10,000 years of martial arts tradition. Simplicity meant if a technique took 3 movements when one would work, throw it away. Directness meant the shortest distance between you and your opponent. No dancing, no wasted motion. Freedom meant adapting instantly to whatever happened, becoming water that could freeze into ice or flow around obstacles. Students who came expecting to learn ancient secrets found something more radical. Bruce would put them in front of a heavy bag on day 1.
Yes, that is in fact Bruce Lee's 700-pound boxing bag.
And tell them to hit it however it felt natural. Then he'd strip away everything unnecessary, rebuild their instincts from scratch, and add techniques from 15 different fighting styles. There were no belts, no ranks, no forms to memorize, just constant sparring against different opponents until fighting became as natural as breathing. The traditional masters organized meetings to discuss how to stop Bruce from corrupting their ancient arts. They sent champions to challenge him, thinking conventional technique would expose his freestyle approach as reckless. Every single one left defeated and confused. Bruce wasn't just mixing styles randomly. He was building a science of combat that treated traditional martial arts like outdated software that needed upgrading. Skull-shattering strike, the deadliest technique. Yoichi Nakachi wasn't some dojo pretender. He was a legitimate danger wrapped in a black belt, third degree in both karate and judo, founder of his own fighting system, Shinpu Ren, known for being merciless and effective. In Japan, he'd survived real street fights against armed attackers. When he opened his school in Seattle in 1959, experienced fighters spoke his name with respect. Then rumors reached him about a Chinese kid disrespecting Japanese martial arts. Bruce Lee was 20 years old, teaching Wing Chun classes to cover rent while attending university. Word spread that he'd been claiming Chinese systems were superior. For Nakachi, this wasn't just an insult, it was something that needed correction. He spent weeks hunting Bruce down, publicly demanding they settle it. The underground fight community assumed they'd witness an execution. Decorated master versus cocky student. This should be simple. The YMCA handball court became their battlefield. No officials, no safety rules. Just two fighters and witnesses who swore silence. What happened next took 11 seconds and defied everything anyone knew about fighting. Bruce didn't dance or stall. He attacked like a storm. Punches came in combinations too fast to track, each one connecting, each one forcing Nakachi backward. 20 years of training couldn't help him. There was no opening to counter, no rhythm to exploit. Then Bruce's foot crashed into Nakachi's skull. The master crumpled instantly. Unconscious, fractured skull. 11 seconds to erase 2 decades of mastery. The eyes of the dragon. In fights, Bruce moved with perfect precision, reading his opponents like they were written in large print. But take away his glasses and ask him to identify someone across the room? Impossible. Without those thick lenses, his world dissolved into shapeless shadows. Anything past arm's length became unrecognizable. -5 diopters in both eyes meant anything past arm's length dissolved into meaningless shapes. The martial artist famous for reading opponents' movements couldn't actually see their faces during fights. The condition was severe enough that when the U.S. Army drafted him in 1963, they took one look at his vision test and stamped him 4F. Medically unfit for service. The same eyesight that disqualified him from military duty somehow didn't stop him from becoming the most feared fighter of his generation. Most people would see this as a career-ending handicap. Bruce saw it as forced evolution. In Hong Kong street brawls during his teenage years, he couldn't rely on seeing punches coming. He learned to identify threats by silhouettes, weight shifts, and shoulder drops milliseconds before strikes launched. While perfectly sighted fighters waited to see attacks, Bruce had already moved. The blur that should have crippled him became the reason he developed awareness that other martial artists never needed. The disability became his greatest teacher. While other fighters watched eyes for tells, Bruce read entire bodies. A hip rotation revealed a kick. A shoulder twitch exposed a punch before the fist moved. He could identify opponents by their walk from across a room where faces were just fuzzy ovals. Vision became irrelevant when you could feel the violence coming through changes in air pressure and body language. Contact lenses in the 1960s were hard plastic torture devices that felt like glass shards grinding against eyeballs. Bruce wore them during filming anyway, hiding constant pain from the crews. Between takes on Enter the Dragon, he'd disappear to apply numbing drops. The famous intensity of his stare partly came from forcing focus through plastic that scraped his corneas with every blink. Bruce spent years practicing forms completely blindfolded, navigating by sound and air movement alone. His Chisao training reached levels where he fought entirely through touch, feeling opponents' energy and redirecting it before they committed to attacks. Danny Nosanto said sparring blindfolded Bruce felt like fighting someone who could see through their skin. The dragon didn't need eyes to hunt. He'd turned a crippling limitation into a superpower. When students asked how he reacted to attacks he couldn't see, Bruce would tap his temple. The eyes were just one tool. The body had 100 others if you knew how to listen. That's all for Bruce Lee's feats. Don't miss the videos on screen now. They're just as interesting. Catch you in the next one.